City of Portland Planning Commission meeting. I am calling the meeting to order. We have full attendance today. Commissioner Lang, Vice Chair Thompson, Vice Chair Pouncil, I am Chair O'Mara, Commissioner Alexander, Commissioner Spivak, Commissioner Patel, and joining virtually, Commissioner Routh. And I will start with any items of interest from commissioners generally. And then after we get through directors report, I'll ask for a round robin on the items specific to the agenda today. Any general items of interest from commissioners? Go ahead, Commissioner Routh.
Thank you. Happy Election Day to the about 600 voters in the city of Maywood Park, the city within a city, who's doing an advisory measure on possibility of hooking up to Portland's sewer system because they've been on septic tanks. So a wonderful time to be alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Routh. Any other items of interest from commissioners? Okay. Patricia, do you have a director's report for us today?
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Patricia Diefendorfer, Chief Planner for the record. I don't have any director's report. I do have some opening remarks I'd like to make when we're ready to take up the first item.
Okay, I think we are ready. We will move on to our main agenda item for today, which is a work session on the Housing Regulatory Relief Project. I will go ahead and pass the mic back to you, Patricia, for opening remarks, and then we will do Commissioner round robin.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to just share a few. I wanted to just provide some context for the deliberations that you're about to have. I know that it has been, and has been pointed out by many of you, that it's been very difficult to consider this project and the idea of relaxing certain regulations and processes that aim to ensure developments in the city are well-designed, sustainable, and contribute to an active public realm. I know we've all been feeling that. A lot of these regulations, as we heard through the testimony, had stakeholders who are very, invested and involved in their creation. However, we also know that we are in an extraordinary time with a housing crisis and macroeconomic conditions, not to mention the cost of construction, high interest rates, that make it very difficult for housing developers to build the housing that is needed to meet the city's housing demand. I wanted to just share a few things that I've learned from some recent studies that have been prepared for the city. Studies recently prepared by Eco Northwest for Prosper Portland, the economic development agency of the city, that informed the Advanced Portland 5-year economic development strategy, found that different districts and corridors in the city have fared differently during the pandemic and in their recovery post-pandemic. In particular, central city subdistricts that have a greater mix of housing and jobs have proven to be more resilient, while those that have more of a dependency on office and workers have fewer housing units, saw the greatest job losses, and have been having a slower recovery. This is also true in the corridors in the city, which have had mixed recovery. Some have seen greater stability supported by remote workers, but others have seen decreases in employment and relatively flat rent growth across the retail spaces. We know that the office market and retail sectors are interlinked, that the decline in the office workers and visitors, which in Central City there's been 31% less foot traffic from visitors compared to the pre-pandemic. All of these trends have affected the retail sector in the Central City subdistricts and are seeing retail vacancy rates that range from just under 3% in the Central East Side to as much as 9% in the downtown subdistrict. We're also generally seeing a decline in development activity, particularly in the Central City. Just to give you a sense of, BDS keeps track of applications for permits, and in the current fiscal year, the first quarter, which ended in September of 2023, the total number of applications for permits received was 1,504, with a total valuation of nearly $300 million. In the same quarter this fiscal year, those number of applications for permits is down 20%, and the valuation of those permits is down 41%. And generally, we've been seeing a decline in the number of multi-dwelling projects in the central city, particularly. In the last 2 decades, there's generally been 10 or fewer multi-dwelling buildings in the central city. And so far this year, we are seeing 4 buildings in Central City and 26 buildings, multi-dwelling buildings built elsewhere in the city. So I just want to share some of these trends just to paint the picture of the climate that we're in and the kind of circumstances that we're facing, which I know all of us know. We see articles in the paper every day about businesses leaving the city. And so really just want to impress the uniqueness of this time, even as compared to the pandemic. When you look at the permit numbers and the valuation, that activity is actually less now than it was even during the pandemic years. So just want to provide that context for as you go into your deliberations and considering these changes, which really are the city's way of demonstrating, the flexibility and really sending a message to investors that the city is a good place to invest in and develop in. And so we just want to make sure that all these factors are kind of taken into account. And with that, I conclude my remarks, and I'm happy to pass it back to you, Chair O'Meara.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Before we do the round robin, I do need to ask if there are any disclosures or conflict of interest items from commissioners relevant to this item. Okay, seeing none, I'd like to invite commissioners round robin if you'd like to share any feedback from the hearing, any other sort of high-level thoughts or considerations before we go into a more detailed deliberation guided by staff members here today. And we are not voting today, but the outcome is so that we can provide staff a solid sense of what amendments we would like to recommend going into the November 14th Planning Commission meeting where we will be voting on this item. So with that, invite any commissioners to share some high-level thoughts before we go into more detail around specific amendments and deliberation. Okay.
Will we be doing a discussion on each topic as we go?
Yes, so just as an overview for the process today, we do have the memo that has been prepared by BPS staff, which essentially pulls forward all of the comments, questions, amendment ideas that we have collectively provided to them. And that has been organized into topic-specific items. There are 7 items that we will be guided through with staff support today, essentially that have been grouped around potential amendment ideas or comments. So that is the order for today. We'll be sort of deep diving into those and having deliberation regarding those items, but just wanted to offer a few minutes here since we did not have opportunity for round robin really succinctly at the last meeting. Go ahead, Commissioner Spivak.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Meara, and thanks for having this time that we can talk in person. I was distracted last meeting, but I will say just the perspective I'm bringing. I mean, I was on the commission when we adopted a lot of the changes that we're looking at revising right now. And so I'm proud of the changes we did back then. I also acknowledge that was time in the boom cycle of the city when we were building like crazy. And although we were sensitive to costs then, we might be more sensitive to them today. So I'm going to be maybe middle of the road on this. I'm torn. I mean, some of these things I think I appreciate the chance to look back at those decisions made to potentially make some changes. I also acknowledge I'm a small developer, and I think we'd like to think that um, building in Portland is done by lots of small builders with local banks and stuff like that. And I acknowledge that the reality is that our housing need is largely created by bigger developers who have bigger resources, not necessarily local. And that's probably been the case forever. It's for my lifespan at least. So although that's not the world I swim in, I recognize it exists. And um, and I appreciate the chance that the Planning Commission gets to make the recommendation. We haven't really had a time to really hear lots of public input on any project since this commission was launched, and then to use both that knowledge and our own knowledge to recommend to City Council what we're doing. So appreciate the staff for giving us a proposed draft and to us now to figure out what we want to send forward. Thanks.
I was just going to earlier just say I don't see our other commissioner on our screen. So I decided to go online to be able to see Commissioner Ralph. So
Thank you for that, Vice Chair Pouncil. And Vice Chair Thompson, go ahead.
Is this on? Okay, yep. I also feel like I'm kind of taking a bit of a middle of the road approach here, and I think that for me, my thinking falls down process versus product lines a little bit. I feel like many of the proposed changes are in the area of process, land use process, approvals process, and that's an area where I feel like we need to make some changes as a city and make things as easy as possible for housing to get built. The work of the Bureau and the Planning Commission and all the parties in the public who show up to meetings and testify is to create a code that represents the values of the city and that's clear and that's comprehensible. And I think that we should be able to just point to that and say, if you follow the code, then, going through all of these other steps that can add time and uncertainty into the process is not adding enough value to offset, whatever benefit they do bring. On the other side of the coin, for me, there's the changes to the actual product, which is the buildings themselves. And this is where I think that we have to really think long term about the value of the proposed changes relative to the costs, of doing away with them either permanently or just on a short term basis. For me, the ones that have environmental impacts, I'm not supportive of, because I think that that we need to acknowledge that we're in both a time of housing crisis and environmental crisis and not pit those two things together. We have to find solutions that acknowledge the realities of both of those. I also think that in the case of what's been put forth with these proposed changes, the environmental policies I do not think are worthy trade-offs, because they add very little cost to projects and provide a really big benefit, in particular with the eco roofs. We did have a little bit of data at the last meeting about the potential cost of adding an eco roof, but it was acknowledged that the cost of doing alternate on-site stormwater management, which is a requirement still by Bureau of Environmental Services, was not included, and that would be something like a dry well. So for me, the heat island, habitat, stormwater quality and management impacts of something like an eco roof for a nominal or maybe not even an added cost to the project is just something that that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So we heard so much testimony last time, and I think we all expressed appreciation for everyone that showed up here, but I just wanted to do that again. Really appreciative of the public, weighing in on this and just the volume of testimony that we got.
Okay, Chair O'Meara, just a few brief comments. Also want to express appreciation for the wealth of expertise that was provided through public testimony. It's just really amazing to see community members show up and express concern and support. And I really learned a lot through the testimony that has been provided on all fronts. Also appreciate staff and fellow commissioners for making time for us to really deliberate and have this extra work session today. I am largely supportive of the package and really looking forward to getting into some of the finer details. But as Commissioner Spivak and Vice Chair Thompson shared, I do not support the 2 items of ecological impact. I do have one suggestion on the eco roof, and the neighborhood contact is another area where I would like to dive in a bit deeper and propose an amendment to that section. But absolutely recognize the importance of us showing leadership and responsiveness and moving this forward. As the Planning Commission and City of Portland, I think, I'm confident that we'll be able to strike a good balance here and recommend a package that has meaningful impact, but also represents some careful consideration and modifications of areas where we don't think the needle will be moved significantly enough in the actual outcomes for housing production. So if there are no other comments, Commissioner Patel, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, a few brief, just general comments. I very appreciative, like everyone said, of everyone's feedback, and the feedback that we got was across all spectrums and a wide variety of perspectives, which is really helpful. And as so my background is as a land use attorney, and so oftentimes I'm working with developers, and I've had exposure working with staff too on different projects. So I in across different jurisdictions, including the city. So I know the value of, through experience of these standards and what they promote, and in the large part is promoting sustainable development practices and green building. So I certainly empathize with the concerns of issues that we're dealing with. But on the other hand, we are facing a crisis, and there's no sugarcoating it. The urgency is now. There's been a long underproduction of housing, of needed and essential housing for decades now across the state, including the city. And so I think the package as proposed are reasonable measures to help with feasibility at a time where needed housing is really essential, and at a time that we're facing challenging market factors, as been discussed with high construction costs, high cost of debt, rising inflation. So I think on balance, these are reasonable measures. And the other note I'd like to make is when we start self-selecting and cherry-picking out standards, I think it defeats the purpose of the package as proposed. We can, an individual standard may impact an incremental cost and it may seem negligible, but the combination of the package as proposed can have an impact on feasibility. So it can help rather than hinder the production of housing at again a time of real need. So I'm going to leave it at there, and for me, I'm currently supportive of the package as proposed, but I'm open to hear considerations and feedback from fellow commissioners.
I'm having oh, it's working. Mike Alexander for the record. I want to, in some ways, piggyback on a point that Commissioner Patel raised. I think for me, this is a scenario that has what I would call parallel truths. that sort of encompass all that we will discuss. And in some ways, the greater and lesser of equals. I mean, there are 7 considerations that will come before us. I'm trying to figure out how we use this time to determine whether we are going to reformat the proposal or look at each of those individually. And you know, we have a set of recommendations that have been presented to us as a comprehensive package versus 7 individual decisions that we're being asked to make. And I need to think about what success looks like at the end of this, because it affects how I think about it. You only have to go through, you know, the exercise that our Congress went through on the budget caps. I mean, at the end of the day, nobody left that room getting what they wanted when they came in. It just didn't work that way. And I want to get some sense of how we best meet our charge, whether it's to look at the total viability of the package unchanged relative to gains and losses versus individual thumbs up, thumbs down, because that's a very different process in my head. And that's what I'm trying to figure out. So I hope that at some point we have a sense of what the destination has to look like in order for us to meet our charge. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for all the hard work that's been done, and as folks have said earlier too, all the incredible comments that Portlanders have made to us about the package here. I think that it's important to for us. Well, I think it's important to realize that this is I kind of see this as somewhat of an experiment, and that and sometimes you have to allow, what's the proverb? Allow 1,000 flowers to bloom, but I was having a conversation today, and that was, and a NASA, comment came up about maybe, it's not always wise to move super fast, to get something done, that's going to be successful. And I think that there's been a lot of work that has been placed into some of the codes that we have, especially when, and I'm new to this information, but, I'm aware of a lot of the hard work that has went into the codes that we do have, and I'm also aware of how we are, Portland itself has, is a leader in a lot of code. But people come here from all over the world to see that what we're doing, and I don't think that everyone should necessarily, get everything that they want, that there has to be some form of compromise. But I think it's important that we don't move backwards on a lot of the core hard work that many Portlanders have put into the codes that we have. And those are, and I'm speaking specifically on the environmental codes, I think that there are things that is in the package that we can work on, and that there can be, movement forward on, that will satisfy developers. But I don't necessarily think that we should be able to, everyone's going to have to take a haircut is basically how I see it. But as Commissioner Thompson said earlier, we are in a crisis, not just in a housing crisis, but we're also in an environmental crisis, and we just cannot. I personally cannot move forward with us leveraging our environmental code for the sake of housing. But I'm more than happy to work on other things that are in this package, and I don't think that there's the weight of the package will be less with some of those compromises. But I'm want to deliberate more, and hopefully we'll just keep moving forward.
Wade Lang for the record. First, Patricia, thank you for putting everything in the context as to why this was brought to us in the first place. Appreciate that. Commissioner Spivak, you said something I think was very important. You talked about the local small developers, and there's certainly those, but you mentioned the larger developers, and a lot of those are out of the city, out of the state, and maybe even out of the country. And those developers are watching Portland to see if they're serious about doing something about the housing crisis. And this package represents, I think, a well thought out package of regulations that can be set aside for 5 years to kind of kickstart some of the development that is in the pipeline but not moving right now. And I think it shows that the city of Portland is very serious about working to solve the housing crisis. I appreciate all the work that's been done on these regulations over the years. I sat on that side of the table, arguing some of them in the past. A lot of work has gone into it. A lot of thought has gone into it. And I've been going back and forth on this ever since it was brought to us. But at the end of the day, when I walk 2 blocks from my house and see people living on the streets, and we declare a housing emergency, yet we're not ready to do the things that we need to do to make sure we're doing everything we can to help that crisis and resolve that crisis. I think we really have to look at that from that lens first and make the decision based on that. Thank you.
Commissioner Roth, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair O'Meara, and I really appreciate the thoughtfulness and gravity that everyone has brought to this, and I'm not surprised by it, but it's noteworthy. And again, appreciate everyone who is engaged in this and offered testimony. I too, like Commissioner Lang just said, I've been going back and forth as well. I agree that these are all difficult, and like Commissioner Thompson said, I'm much more in the if looking to process as opposed to product is one way that I have been thinking about it, because some of the zoning codes, some of the codes that we're considering have gone through so much process over the years that if in future, well, I will say that if individual projects have issue, that is a problem with the code, and if we are following code, that that we should be getting the results that we have that we want, and so yeah, I think process for me is not easy to wiggle with, but easier certainly than some of the product, particularly eco roofs and bird glazing. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you to all of the commissioners. And I see Vice Chair Thompson. You would like to?
I had one thing that I forgot to mention, and I wanted to bring it up just in reaction to this idea of taking the package as a whole versus dissecting it into individual parts and pieces and evaluating the merit of each of those. And I just wanted to reflect on the fact that this package is not the only opportunity that the city has to remove barriers to development. I think it's really important that we consider what we have heard from developers about what the obstacles are to development. And some of the biggest themes aren't even in front of us right now. Inclusionary housing, there's been an entire work group around that, looking at how we make improvements there. System development charges, the timing or the ability to waive some of those. I think that there are a lot of really impactful improvements that are happening outside of just this conversation. And just going back to the survey that was kind of the origin point for some of this, there were some items on the survey that you had to, like, when you go to the website and it summarized the survey results, I didn't even see eco roofs on there as like one of the top 10 items. You actually had to go to like the report, and I think it was like item 13 or 14 in terms of order of importance. And so I just want us to be mindful again about that trade-off. And just because something was included in the survey, if it was ranked, really low down relative to some of these other themes, then let's just be thoughtful about the value that is provided by the original requirement, before we look at pausing it. Thanks.
Thank you to all of the commissioners for your comments. And I did hear somewhat of a question from Commissioner Alexander in terms of intent for today. So I'm hoping that introducing Sandra Wood and Phil Namany, if you could provide just an overview of what you were both thinking in terms of how we would go through the memo. And I'm hoping that'll help answer your question, Commissioner Alexander, in terms of what we're aiming for today. But if not, feel free to chime in if that doesn't.
Yeah, I would welcome that. And again, I want to be transparent. I'm approaching this, and this is only my framing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm either going to accept all of it or none of it. That's it. I mean, so because I understand there's just no easy transition within some of these issues. So that's how I'm framing it in my head. Now, that may not be the approach that others take, which I welcome, but I want to be very clear. It's either a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and that's my perspective.
Commissioners, Patricia Diefenhofer, just really quickly, I do think it's really interesting. I appreciated a number of different comments, of course, but this notion of whether the package is a whole or whether parts of it can move forward, I think that we're happy to discuss it. I definitely believe that there are parts that it's not an all or nothing proposition, I would say. Let me just say it that way. I do think it will get more challenging if the commission is looking to try to, I'm trying to find the right word, I'm sorry. If the commission is trying to modify the standard, I think that becomes a little more tricky because it's not, we wouldn't have had the time to really evaluate, should it be 20% or 30%? That's where I would say it would get more tricky, and I would have some concerns there. But whether or not particular elements of the package, we want to debate the merits of the various elements of the package, I think that's entirely reasonable. So I just wanted to share that in case that's helpful, and perhaps Sandra has something else she might want to add, or Phil, for that matter.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sandra Wood, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Thank you for having us today, and thanks for your thoughtful feedback and reflection. I'm glad you were able to spend some time doing that. I'm the co-development manager at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and Phil Namany is the project manager for this project. I guess there was two things that I was reflecting on: the idea of the difference between product and process. So in the package are 16 proposals. 5 proposals are about process. One of those is on the table to talk about today, about neighborhood contact. The rest of them we didn't receive comments from you about. So the other 11 are about the product, like what is this building going to look like once it's built, or if conversions are happening. So I just was reflecting on what the package says. I agree, Commissioner Alexander, with Patricia that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing, and I'm curious to understand your thinking more about that. The zoning code has, I'm not even going to guess how many regulations, but a lot of regulations. And this package is proposing a temporary suspension to just 17 of those regulations. When we were scoping the project, along the lines of what you all heard through the public testimony and what you've observed or participated in, there had been a lot of discussions about putting these regulations in place to begin with. And that's why we landed on what if we just did a temporary suspension for projects that are including housing. That's the main theme of the whole thing. And I think where I hope you all agree with that premise, and maybe that's a way to discuss this. Like if that's the premise that we're going with, which is what we've proposed, then we get into the devils in the details, right? About like which provisions and I agree also with Patricia that we didn't want to take each of these proposals and say there's yet another alternative to the regulations that are in place, partially because we're hearing a lot of feedback that the regulations are getting too complex anyway, right? And so the regulations on the books right now already have a level of complexity. If we came up with an alternative version of the regulations, that just adds another layer. So the temporary suspension for 5 years for housing projects was the main proposal. So those are my thoughts about the all or nothing or how we approach the project. Perhaps we can get into the actual topics and maybe that will inform the conversation further. Does that sound good? Okay. So we published a memo on November 3rd and sent it to the commission. And as Chair O'Mara said, we consolidated all the comments and questions and ideas that commissioners sent us. There are 7 topics on our plate today. And we put neighborhood contact first. That's a process change. And we put it first because I thought it would be easier and I want a good win at the beginning of this. So we can get on a roll here, hopefully. I think and correct me if I'm wrong, we did put which commissioner had each of the comments. I hope you've read them. We certainly have. The first comments from Commissioner Thompson. I think it's just a comment. And then Commissioner O'Mara had an idea for an amendment to maintain a minimum requirement of the site sign posting. Do you want to speak to that, Commissioner O'Mara, or you want me to?
Sure, yeah. And I will ask for confirmation in terms of if I was reading the proposal correctly around and just current requirements that there is a square footage threshold, right, of 25,000 feet to trigger the neighborhood contact requirements currently. 25,000 square feet and above. Is that correct?
There's different thresholds. So there's a 10,000 square foot to post a sign on the site, 25,000 square foot to post the sign and hold a meeting that the developer would organize. And then the caveat that we're actually making a permanent change is this other subcategory for when you have something in the design overlay zone, it has a lower threshold, and then you work with the neighborhood association. So that's a piece we're pulling out permanently. Our proposal was for 5 years. So it was neighborhood contact 1, 2, and 3. The 3 is the kind of special situation. That's what we're pulling out. And then our proposal was to suspend both neighborhood contact 1 or 2 for 5 years. Which I think you were interested in is whether neighborhood contact 1 could apply for the whole gamut. So even larger projects potentially would only post a sign and not go through the meeting. So I think that's what you put on the table. I know
Correct.
There were some other comments about whether neighborhood contact in general is a good thing to continue having, or whether our proposal to suspend it was a good idea.
Thank you for that. And I would offer that my amendment would propose a site sign posting for 25,000 square feet projects and above. And I would like there to be a contact provided, whether that is the development contact, the developer, or the architect, so that interested neighbors and community members know who they could reach out to. If possible, also a city contact, just for inquiry in terms of getting more information about the project.
So two things about that. The posters do always have a development contact. So that's part of it. It's hard to have a city contact because the city other than the web page that is created for the neighborhood contact that the developer deals with on their own, they may work with somebody at the Development Services Center to get the poster. But that's generally the only contact there is. And so there is no city knowledge of the project.
It hasn't been
essentially.
assigned to a planner yet.
No
is what it
permit, there's no
means, 'cause
land use
it's-
review. It's the
hasn't come
idea
in the
was to kind of have the developer, and especially in the case of a meeting, have the developer and the interested neighbors of their association or whoever happens to want to be part of it to have a dialogue outside of the city process. So I think we'd want to keep that. The other thing with the 10,000 versus 25,000, I would push back a little bit on that because that gets back to Sandra's question about amending what's already there, which is the 10% or 20% kind of thought. I think the easiest thing to do would be to say, okay, at 10,000, it's a posting, and 10,000 and above, because that is what our language already has. And we would
Okay.
just essentially waive the meeting for 5 years.
Sure.
So
Okay,
we would,
I
we would
appreci-
move that. It's actually a lot of code changes from what we have in our document, but the end result is simple. It just basically you would change the process in the neighborhood contact chapter to say for 5 years we would waive the meeting requirement.
Correct. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And I certainly don't want to make it even more complicated. So if it makes more sense to maintain that 10,000 square foot, then I support that. Commissioner Spivak?
I think this is just a technical question. I'm inclined to support this. When does the sign go out relative to, do you have to post a sign by the time you apply for your building permit or a certain time before it?
And this is another case where COVID kind of tweaked without our code changing. Technically, you're supposed to post a sign. You're supposed to do that within, I think, 45 days or at least 35 days.
And no
not
more than 1 year.
A year before you file for the building permit or land use review. The way the code was written, technically, we're not supposed to accept the permit or the land use review until they've done that. With COVID and virtual meeting requirements and so on, BDS has sort of taken a little less of a strict policy, so they just determine whether that has to happen for them to determine to be complete. So somebody can, if they forget, right now, if they forget to post it, basically they'll still take the permit in as an example, and they'll just make sure that they do it before they kind of finish their review. But
I guess I'm wondering whether we want to formalize that, if that's what's happening in practice, because it would be tough if you have a situation where someone forgot their project is a little bit too small. They get an intake, and then they get to check sheets, and then they learn they have to do it. They have to go back and start again. So I appreciate that staff has not been making people do that when they forget, but maybe this is a chance to fix that so that you have to do it, in other words, before you apply.
I think we'd want to do a little more analysis on
Okay.
the success of it, partially, because once again, it was sort of a quick thing. We actually didn't even know that was the case until we were going through and releasing this draft, and I think it was just a case that in the past, if somebody came in and said they wanted to do the permit, the intake person would say, "Did you do your neighborhood contact?" If they said no, they'd say, "Here's your papers. Go do that before you reassign."
And the intent is for the community to have an opportunity to talk to the developer before the developer finalizes their proposal to the city. So I think that's where those dates came from.
So can I, and also just
Well,
to
I'll say
Oh.
I don't feel strongly on this, but I do feel pretty strongly that whatever the code says, the BDS should implement it that way. So if one of them needs to change, then that sounds great.
Just to clarify, though, I think Patricia Diefenhofer, for the record, it's the requirement is really, so it can be, there's quite a long time in there. So really the intent is to give the community a heads up that something is going on the site and the ability to contact the developer. So well before a planner at BDS or a staff person at BDS is assigned to it. So that's the intent, and the intent is a good one. And I think the other issue is something that we want to look into. But I think what the chair is recommending sounds like a reasonable compromise.
Okay. And I know, Vice Chair Thompson, you had a comment on this item as well for neighborhood contact. Did you want to speak to your comment? In the memo is what I'm referring to.
I think I already summed it
Okay.
up with the opening
Okay.
comments. Thanks.
Great. Well, I think
Great.
we can move on to the next item.
Okay.
Thank you
great.
so much.
So the next item, so that was the easy one. The next item is eco roofs, and what we saw in here were a couple of comments of proposing an amendment that would retain the eco roof requirement, so don't waive it for 5 years. We also saw some discussion about maybe we could allow more of the roof to not be eco roof if it was some ecological or sustainable design feature or solar panels, for example. So the way it works right now is that this only applies in certain situations. So new buildings in
Central City,
just Central City? Is that where we have? New buildings in
over a certain size.
over a certain size. Okay. And that the code is written that the whole roof needs to be an eco roof, except 40% can be other things. And we did provide some information at the back of the memo with what those other things could be. And there's a list: mechanical equipment, stairwells, skylights, solar panels are included in that. So it could be that 40% of the building is solar panels and 60% of the building is an eco roof. There were some questions about curiosities about the projects that had gotten modifications or adjustments to the standard, and we looked into that, and Phil has some info to share about that.
So, and I don't think I introduced myself earlier. Phil Naimaney with Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. As we mentioned, there may actually be 6 adjustments. I think there was an adjustment or a modification to historic review as well. But as far as what was proposed under the modifications, they really ran the gamut. In some cases, it went down from 60% just to 58%. So it was a very slight modification. It was, of course, as also part of an overall design review. There were a couple situations where people asked to go down to 0. In one case that was granted. I think it had to do with the fact that I think there was the building was trying to meet the living building challenge, and there were some issues with providing eco roofs and meeting that, the net zero energy and water use. There was another case where they went down to 0, but they actually got denied. And the reason they got denied, what they wanted to do was do solar, but the response to that is that solar and eco roofs can coexist. So I think that's where we get into the sort of the gray area, that it's kind of tough to kind of come up with some other percentage or to try to exempt if you're doing solar or if you're doing some other green feature, because I think in these cases, a lot of times with the modifications, it looked like it was a case-by-case review and probably relied a lot on what BES and their stormwater folks came in. In one of the cases where they did grant to go down to 0 is because it was a larger site, and I think they were going to be able to do stormwater retention on the site, not necessarily required to have that as an eco roof. So that's kind of the mixture of review types of modifications, but they ran from 0 to barely under the 60%, but it seemed like the justifications for them really ran the gamut.
Commissioner Lang, for the record. I remember when we were developing Haslow, and there wasn't a requirement for eco roofs at that time, but we had determined that we were going to go for LEED Platinum certification for the 3 multifamily blocks that we were developing. And that was because we felt that in the city of Portland, that's the expectation. And if we didn't build to that level, we would be kind of under building to the population we're trying to serve. Do you have any kind of feel for how that is now? I mean, would a developer who doesn't necessarily have to install an eco roof, might they still want to simply because it's Portland and that's the expectation?
I think we've had some experience where this only applies in the central city currently, and we have had experience where people outside the central city are proposing eco roofs. And once again, it may have something to do with how the soils can accommodate stormwater. It may be to do with the intensity of the development. One we kind of came across recently was one up Vancouver Williams. And so I think your point about, some folks may just say, hey, I want that plaque. I want to show that I've considered sustainable features and want to incorporate that into the building, and it's either a selling point or it's just the right thing to do. I think there is that provision even outside the central city when it's not required.
Okay, thank you for that follow-up on the projects that had sought an exemption. That's very helpful information. I would invite either Commissioner Spivak or Vice Chair Thompson. Both of you had comments on this section. Would you like to speak to your thoughts or potential amendments for EcoRoof?
Well, maybe I'd like to listen to Commissioner Thompson and yourself, because I'm open to a compromise on this one, to make it easier to have other systems on a roof that are ecologically supportive. So maybe I'll just listen to other people, what they've thought of.
Phil, you addressed this a little bit, talking about some of the exceptions that had been pursued to this requirement. And I hear you that solar panels and eco roofs can coexist. In my experience, 40% of a roof's area is kind of the bare minimum that you need to accommodate mechanical and elevator overruns, things like that for buildings that are approaching the size threshold that we're even talking about here. So I don't think that for projects that are interested in solar, that it's very likely that they're going to be able to have the kind of impact on their energy production that they would like to within that 40%, just because of other things that make sense to locate on a roof. I mean, when you start looking at locating mechanical equipment in a building instead of on the roof, there's a lot of inefficiencies and reasons why that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I was trying to do the thing that you're encouraging us to not do, which is to modify the existing requirement to provide more flexibility for projects that are striving to be more sustainable than our code requires. And you provided the example of a Living Building Challenge project. That is like the most sustainable building certification that exists: net zero water, net zero energy. It sounds like that there is still an avenue for projects like that to seek case-by-case exception. And so I'm willing to let go of my proposed amendments here, or I guess tweaks, and instead just say I do not support getting rid of the eco roof requirement. And while I'm up here with the mic on, I'll just add that for me, this really comes down to more than just the stormwater piece. It's the heat island piece. And we look at the summer of 2021, I think 72 people in Multnomah County perished because of the heat wave that we had. And a professor at PSU did some analysis on temperature differentials across the city. And while I think that city of Portland in like official measurements was recorded at 116 degrees, out in like Lentz or in heat island areas, it was 8 degrees higher at 124 degrees. So it just doesn't make sense to me that in the year 2023, when we've seen the direction that extreme weather is going, when we've seen fellow Portlanders perish because of extreme conditions, that we would continue to do business as usual and not require that buildings take measures to mitigate their heat island effect. So that's it.
Thank you, Vice Chair Thompson. I was also recommending a modification to current code, so along that same theme. And the rationale for my recommendation comes from my experience developing affordable housing for Central City Concern. We opened a new building downtown last December, and we looked at, I don't think Eco Roof was actually required at that time, but because we consistently provide solar panels on our roof as both an ecological measure and we cover the cost of utilities for the majority of our buildings so that cost is not passed on to the low income tenants. And so for us, it becomes a decision around both ecological impact and not passing on higher utility costs, right? Realizing that savings to us as an affordable housing operator. So in that building example, we did max out most of the roof capacity with solar PVs and the mechanical equipment, and we did not have an eco roof requirement. So just based on that experience, I was advocating for an eco roof requirement could be waived in the central city if there was a photovoltaic infrastructure of 50% of the roof capacity or more. But I understand the complexity of really enforcing that from a percentage perspective. So I think I would tend to agree with Vice Chair Thompson that if we can't achieve that, and there's still a path to exemption for project cases such as the one that I've described, where we can present to the city, here's why we want an exemption to Eco Roof, because we are installing significant solar infrastructure. That's a cost savings to us long term as an affordable housing provider, et cetera, that would be still an option. Then I would agree with an amendment to not remove that requirement for the central city.
I just want to, oh, I'm sorry.
My instinct is to hope that we can do an amendment like you just described, because a type 2 approval takes several $1,000s in a few months to get through. And perhaps we sort of log what amendment ideas get floated, and then it's ultimately a staff time issue, I think, of like, this one might not be all that long compared to some other ones you might think about. And we sort of see how things look at the end of the meeting and just be a candid conversation about how much time is there. So I would be interested myself in seeing that when supporting it.
So one point of clarification I do want to make on this. So this gets triggered in Central City, gets triggered on a new building over 20,000 square feet. So, that new building will go through design review or historic review because that's how our Central City is lined up. So essentially, to get back at Commissioner Thompson's thought, it's going to go through design review. You add a modification to it. So it's not necessarily a separate review. And that's what all these ones have been. They're all about a new building and their proposals to do something alternative on the roof. So it's probably not a big add in terms of time. It may be an add in terms of having a lack of flexibility because they have to kind of indicate through those modification requests why they're better meeting design and also still meeting the intent of the purpose. The one that was really odd in this list was one that was going to do 100%. He was going to do solar array on all of it, and then the condition of approval was that, sure, you can do a solar array, but you still have to do an eco roof. And so I think late in that review process, they just went ahead and said, we're going to do an eco roof. And I think the planner reviewing it or the design commission said, well, here's this condition if you still want to try to do a solar array in the future. But that's where I think there gets to be that negotiation aspect of it. So I don't think it's a super add in terms of time, since these are going to get triggered for a design review anyways.
So what you're saying, we think that project was built with just an eco roof. Is that what you're saying? But they had the flexibility to add solar on over it.
From what I looked at because there was a confusion from some of the folks that were reviewing it. We had somebody in our Central City team reviewing it, and then we had somebody at BDS follow up on that, and then I took a look at the permit, and it looked like the permit just went ahead and provided an eco roof. I think this one is really much more, the question is whether to provide the flexibility up front or not, or have the flexibility be negotiated during a design review.
And I believe, part of what we're struggling with is that we don't have very many examples, right? The code just went into effect in 2018. In Central City, we had 34 buildings built in the Central City that would have triggered this. Out of the 34, 6 of them received modifications. So it's not a very robust set of data that we're working off of. So what I guess just where I think we are is one idea is retaining the eco roof requirement. A second idea is retain the eco roof requirement, but add an exemption for projects that are providing something for solar panels, maybe the whole thing for solar panels, and we can figure out that detail. So I think maybe those 2 ideas on the table right now.
Yeah, and I would hesitate to say 100% solar because, again, we need roof capacity for the mechanical equipment. So that's why I threw out 50% because it was higher than the current 40% in code. But I think those are the two options where we put on the table.
So is that where I think we can move on from there? What we can do is we can write both of those up because the retaining is very easy to write up, and we can figure out the other one. Are we saying that the 50% of solar panels is coming? It's the 40% that you could have used for all mechanical equipment and all this stuff, giving more space if they're doing, or is the 60% of the eco roof section half of that, 50% of that being used for solar?
Well, the other way I was thinking about it would just be that you can, so if you're looking at the 60-40 rule, whatever area of that 60% that you want to dedicate to solar, you would not also need to do an eco roof.
Okay.
That might be a simpler,
thinking.
yeah,
Okay.
another way to think about it.
Great. Shannon's here. She'll get it right. Sounds good. Okay. So moving on to bird safe glazing. Is that where we are? Okay. So bird safe glazing is similar. We have Commissioner Routh saying retain bird safe glazing as an amendment. Commissioner Spivak saying the same thing. There were a couple of questions in here. Maybe we should address those first. One from Commissioner O'Mara asking, is this only applicable to buildings over 60 feet tall? And the answer to that is no, correct, Phil? Bird safe glazing, it applies to the first 60 feet, but it applies to all buildings, new buildings.
It applies to, once again, it's new buildings, and it also applies to major remodels if they are changing at least 75% of their facade. So major remodels defined in our code as being a fairly significant, either from a cost standpoint or by adding a lot of square footage. But in that case, the major remodel would also be having to change significant amount of the skin, basically, of the building.
And Commissioner Thompson, can you help us with your comment?
Sure. There was a testifier. There were many of them, so I can't remember their name, but they were talking about how the ratio that triggers the window to wall ratio that triggers the bird safe glazing requirement was intended to allow fenestration of housing units without triggering the bird safe. So right now, as I understand it, you have to have 30% of a facade be glazing to even trigger the requirement. If you have a facade where less than 30% of the building's facade is glass, you don't have to do it, and that's as it stands. 30% is a pretty reasonable window to wall ratio for housing units, especially when you think about the type of housing units that the city needs to provide, which are ones that are more affordable. We're not talking like glassy curtain wall, yes, that would trigger bird safe. It's beautiful. Everybody loves glass, but if there's a lot of it, you got to put the frit on or do something else. So what that testifier was getting at is that there is a way to do housing, in their opinion, without even triggering this requirement. And I agree with that for floors 2 and up, but I wasn't sure if that was actually reasonable for the ground floor, because the ground floor, if you accept that 30% is kind of a minimum reasonable window to wall ratio for housing units, the ground floor requirements that we have elsewhere might require a glassier ground floor. There are reasons we want glassier ground floors for the pedestrian realm, for activation, all of the other things that we're going to talk about again in a second. And so what I was suggesting was that we look at the facade in a more nuanced, admittedly complex way, which would say that if your window to wall ratio for the residential units typically provided on floors 2 and up is under 30%, you don't have to do bird's-eye glazing on them. We won't penalize you for having a glassier ground floor if you put a frit on just that area. So it would be a little bit more of a balanced approach, because right now, I think if you went with the glassier ground floor, even if you had the 30% up above, you'd trigger it and you'd have to put it everywhere. And I don't know that makes sense. So it's trying to actually put into practice this possibility that I understand was the original intent, was that you could do housing without triggering this requirement.
So the 30% is all inclusive. So it's all the glazing between the ground and up to the 60-foot height above the grade. I think the one thing that, and we've been having this issue just with a lot of our code amendments about what is the ground floor, defining the ground floor, and how we would measure that. So we do, for a lot of our ground floor window provisions, we've actually said things in our base zone, between 2 and 10 feet above grade. For this, it might be a little bit more difficult if somebody's doing a large atrium type mezzanine ground floor lobby piece. Is there some sort of upper limit to where we start counting the 30% or not? And so that's where the nuance, the nuance could be good, and maybe that's something we should look at as a more permanent feature, but I'm not sure if we would hit the right amount if we just said 30% on floors 2 through 5 or not, or if we have to kind of come up with something different.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a layperson's way of putting it, but there's all sorts of precedent in the code already for that zone that you're talking about, that for active ground floors and for fenestration that starts at 2 feet and goes up to 8 feet or whatever it is, and you have to track that along the facade. That's the zone that I'm talking about. So whatever would be the most reasonable way to align that with the bird safe that meets the intent of just not penalizing housing projects that want to have a glassy lobby, or required, depending on what happens with some of the other proposals on the table tonight, to have a glassier, more activated ground floor. And they shouldn't have to put bird safe on the entire, all the upper floors as a result.
And like you said, I think in your comments that you don't want the ground floor, the transparency of the ground floor to people to be penalized for providing transparency on the ground floor, because then it takes the whole facade and it triggers the 30%. I understand now.
Can I just ask a question? So do we know for sure that that's how it's interpreted when the regulation is implemented? So it's almost like an average of 30% across the entirety of the first 60 feet. So if you have more transparency on the ground floor,
It's the full facade, right, Phil?
Well, it's up to the 60 feet, so it's
like
just
if you
measuring the
wanted
first
to
60.
meet that 30% and say that's your typical condition for a unit on the upper floors, you would have to follow that at the ground floor to not throw yourself over the
I see.
threshold.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a little bit of a problem.
Yeah. Okay. Good to understand that. Yeah. Okay. So I think we understand generally the sentiment here on this one. So yeah.
I understand the sentiment. I don't, maybe it would be helpful to know how other commissioners feel about this.
We do a little straw polling as we go here. I'm just wondering if that's an option to, maybe we also know how we feel, and it feels that it's going to be 50% on one side, 50% on the other. If we have a project where everyone's sort of aligned, then we don't have to spend time on it. If we're kind of split,
we
then
can
we're
do
more
straw
motivated to look
poll.
at we're more likely to look for compromise ideas.
Would you like to do a straw poll on this item? Is that your recommendation?
I guess I would like to do a straw poll on this item. I mean, there's different ways to do it, but one would be as is versus versus the amendment idea you just described. Another would be as is, meaning no bird safe glazing, versus the amendment just keep it as proposed draft versus existing. That's one way to do it. I'm not sorry. I'm not
Okay,
very
let's
clear on
start
this.
with a straw poll for the potential amendment.
Yeah.
And so if you are generally supportive of that amendment, go ahead and I think we just raise hand, right, for poll.
Yes, we can do that. The amendment is to craft a way that the ground floor and the amount of windows on the ground floor, which we are presuming to be quite a lot of ground floor windows, doesn't count against the whole facade, that we don't calculate the whole facade up to 60 feet and how much window it is. Instead, we calculate from second to 60 feet up, second floor to 60 feet up.
I mean, another way I think to just like simplify this a little bit is to think about like we either accept staff's proposal in the report and don't amend anything. We amend it by saying we want to just take this out and keep the requirement as it is. Or the third way is to say we want to keep the requirement but adjust it so that a housing project can reasonably be realized without triggering the code.
Which is, I think, the
Which is
poll
the
we're
ground
taking
floor.
right now.
Yeah.
That's the third one, is the one we're
Right.
taking right now.
So let's have a show of hands for general support for the third option, as Vice Chair Thompson has explained. Okay. And Commissioner Routh, I see your hand. So we have
That was 6.
majority
Okay.
support for that item.
So we'll put some more thought to it and think about it, and maybe even call you, Commissioner Thompson, to see if it's an amendment that you'd want to advance. Okay. And we'll bring that back next time. Sorry for not a better explanation for that, Commissioner Alexander. We'll figure out the details. So that was topic number 3. We're moving on to topic number 4, which is ground floor active use and development. This topic, as you know, there are two sets of regulations. One that requires an active ground floor use, so there's this actual use taking place in the ground floor. We didn't see any comments about that, so correct me if I'm wrong. I think all the comments are about the actual development standards, sometimes called design standards, but it's the height of the ground floor and the windows required on the ground floor. Phil, can you?
Sandra, I'm sorry. I just want to point out that Commissioner O'Mara did have a comment. Commissioner Chair O'Mara, if you wanted to describe, your comment seemed to be, again, looking for some kind of a compromise with respect to the use. So that was, I
the
think that
use.
was the
Sorry,
primary
yeah.
comment related to use. Most of the comments were about the more of the design standards, meaning the floor to ceiling heights and the percentage of transparency of windows on the ground floor.
Yes, thank you, Patricia. And again, I'll seek staff's counsel on whether this even makes sense given how code is currently written. But I was wondering if there could be a maintenance of a 25% ground floor active use requirement in these overlay zones and plan districts as currently enforced, but that there could be flexibility in terms of what is defined as ground floor active use. For example, it could be a community room for residents, it could be computer space, it could be property management office, and perhaps that's already in the definition. So I think that's the clarification I'm seeking. I'm trying to make sure we're not mandating commercial retail, but that we are ensuring flexibility.
Patricia Diefendorfer for the record, and I'm sure staff have other information to bring to bear on this, but I would say that that is already built in. And so I think that, and some of the testimony we heard was about even requiring even those kinds of uses are resulting in perhaps space being programmed in ways that, like oversized community rooms, for example, or programmed in ways that they're doing that just to meet a requirement when that space could actually go to to be a dwelling unit or another use that is needed. So I definitely want to make sure that we kind of stay mindful of that. There was also, Commissioner Routh actually had one comment about encouraging live-work uses on the ground floor. And I think similarly, and staff can speak to this more, we discussed this, and there's actually nothing that would prohibit that in the zoning. So if a project were to pursue that kind of use on the ground floor, there would be nothing that would prohibit that.
Okay. I'm inclined to go ahead and have us move on to the next section with that clarification.
Great. So the next section, so we're still in number 4. We're still talking about ground floors, but we're not talking about what uses happen on the ground floor. Instead, we're talking about how they're designed. And in some of areas of the city, there's a required height of 12 feet on the ground floor. And recently, the amount of windows was increased from 40% to 60% in some areas too, right, Phil? And so those were the two proposals that we were, for outside Central City. So not inside Central City, but outside Central City, we were proposing that those be waived for 5 years. And I think Commissioner Thompson had a comment about that. Yeah, I think it's Commissioner Thompson.
And one thing I
yeah.
just want to clarify on that, depending on the window provision, which direction you decide on, we met with Commissioner Spivak earlier on. And actually, there was some technical clarifications that he was looking at, including how that ground floor window provision would get changed if we were going to go from the 60% down to 40%. And so we will have, if you are still in agreement that you want to suspend the 60% requirement, we will probably still come back with a clarification on as a part of a technical amendment about how that 40% is worded basically in the Main Street overlay zone and in the West Portland Town Center. But the 60% provision applies Central City on those specific streets that are mapped, the West Portland Town Center on specific streets around where the transit center is going to be, and then the Main Street overlay zones.
But the proposal doesn't suggest to change that in the Central City, right? Just to be clear.
The 60% would get reduced for 40% if residential use is proposed.
If residential uses are proposed
all of
on the
these
ground
are
floor.
if there's residential use proposed. It's once again it's intended to provide more flexibility if the ground floors has residential uses.
Quick question, Commissioner Patel, for the record, will we get a draft of the technical amendment before our next meeting?
We'll get all the amendments.
okay.
Yeah. So what we're trying to determine today is what should we be writing up in the next 2 days, and our hope is to have it ready by Thursday, late Thursday, and post it on the site so you can take a look at it before the next meeting,
Thank you.
and the public can too.
And the technical amendment is more on just consistency of how the 60% is interpreted and applied?
It was based upon the fact that in Central City it was worded one way, the other two situations were worded differently. And we wouldn't forward that if you decide that you want to keep the 60%. So it's only if the 40% for residential use gets which was our initial proposal, gets forwarded.
Always in favor of a simpler and more readable code. So that's good to know. Thanks.
So I think the other thing which we have, some information on the last page of the handout was the ground floor active standards. It shows the plan districts where we do have those provisions, where on some of the streets we have the higher ground floor requirement. Generally, it has to be 12 feet tall and it has to be maintained for a distance usually of 25 feet back from the street.
Yeah, Commissioner Pouncil here for the record. If there are any changes in the window size, I guess from the 60 to 40, is there any way that in the future that things could be retrofitted back to that 60%? I mean, are these like, is there something that could be placed in?
Do you mean the building
Yep.
itself once it's been built that way, or do you mean
Yes.
in the code
Well,
language?
once it's in the code for the building once it's built, so that if that space wanted to be on the ground floor, wanted to be like traditional retail space with that window size, that it could be transitioned back to that.
Yes, absolutely. There's no maximum amount of windows. So this is just a minimum amount of windows. So if they built with 40% windows in 5-10 years, they decide to increase the amount of windows, they just come in for a building permit increase.
So the infrastructure of the building wouldn't like be built to prohibit that expansion, or to that 60%.
Commissioner Thompson has a response, I think.
Yeah, I think that's getting at my concern with this proposal, is that it doesn't provide enough flexibility for the future, because while it may be, in the abstract possible to increase the window ratio of the ground floor for another use in the future, in practice, that's a lot more difficult. Like, you get a big multi-story building, structural engineers start like getting heart palpitations when you start talking about like carving up their shear walls, or we want to put windows over here. The structural bay that's established for a building is established at the time of construction and to the codes that exist at that time. And so I don't think that very many developers, architects, engineers are going to be designing with that flexibility in mind if they don't have to. And that is a lot more possible to realize even than the floor height change. So if you have like a typical residential floor to floor, it's going to be very difficult to try to shoehorn commercial uses into that after the fact. And once a building is built, I mean, the floor to floor is fixed. There's, short of blowing out big sections of the building, which again, it can be done, but I think that's the issue. And I know we're putting a pause on some of these requirements for 5 years and thinking about it in those terms, but the buildings could be with us for a really long time. And when I think about just the experience of being downtown right now, like you look at some of the buildings that were built, I think like in the early 70s, Wells Fargo Tower, not too far from here. I don't know how many people are familiar with that one. The big white vertical fins, it has like basically a moat around the bottom of it and some parking ramps. There were a lot of like blank facades back then, and that part of downtown from a pedestrian realm standpoint is dead. And that was because of the way that we thought about urban design for a very short period of time back then, and now we're just kind of stuck with it. So I left the use part out because I think that whatever we can do to provide flexibility for residential at the ground floor is important. But just given like where we're at with some of the other issues in the city as far as safety and activation and bringing pedestrians back, that creating conditions that we'll have to live with for a really long time that are a detriment to those principles, we should think really, really carefully about.
Just another response on the conversion question. So for regulated affordable housing, there are very long-term regulatory agreements in place specific to the number of units that are being built. In the city of Portland, with Portland Housing Bureau, that's a 99-year regulatory agreement. And so for an affordable housing building, to build a certain number of units, including ground floor, it's going to be impossible from a regulatory standpoint to then convert those, a certain number of those units to, say, commercial or retail without extensive legal process, right? Because you are building a certain number of units that are regulated. And so, just along those lines of like, can there be flexible conversion? Yes and no, depending on what the project type is and whether it's regulated affordable housing or not.
Yeah,
I guess
Commissioner
Spivak, I guess I'm going to push back a little bit. I think that I like staff's proposed change on this and to drop the regulations because one, it's not dropping it down to zero. You still have to have glazing on the first floor. Another is I've just seen so much ground floor commercial or active use that's not commercial and it's not active. And I live within. I've got affordable housing developments within three corners of me, all recently, all with basically dead first floors, and it's because they are. Well, it's a wage rate relationship, but they basically created this community space on the first floor that doesn't get used, and it's a blank facade. I've also seen commercial businesses on Broadway that are in 8-9 foot buildings. I mean, and then other countries where it's common to have commercial and shorter floor plates. I think that if there's demand for retail figures out how to surface itself. So I guess I feel like I'm okay with the pause. I think that the affordable housing projects you mentioned, they all got built, right? So it's visible, you see the space. But what I don't know is how many market rate projects never got built because they weren't going to spend the money for the tall floor. They just want to put homes on the first floor. I'd rather give them a chance to put homes on the first floor than maybe not build anything at all. So I kind of like what's proposed here.
I think maybe that gets to what Commissioner Pouncil, what you were saying at the beginning of the meeting of like, this is an experiment. And that's a little bit what we're thinking for this 5-year period. Just a thought.
Also,
I could think of a compromise. I mean, there will be compromise. You have to have doors a certain number of every feet or something like that. I mean, there's ways to make it a little more engaging, but I've seen a lot of, I think that as much as I loved and I voted for this package when we did it to have active street uses on these main streets, I'd rather have people live in there than nothing get built.
I just to provide a personal experience of a building block from our house. They did design it for commercial development and leased out all the apartments, but did not lease out the commercial, and then converted it into about 5 or 6, I believe, individual units. And they did not touch the exterior. I think that, once again, that was probably partially because it's in the design overlay and they may not have had to have somebody review against the design standards. So there are units there. They actually have full glazing storefronts. They actually kept the storefront doors, which I'm assuming they lock from the inside. I've never seen anybody go in those doors, which kind of gets at the idea about, do we have some sort of separation, of public entrances? But I think you can always design it so that the doors are also accessed from an interior hallway. So I think it can be done. I mean, I've seen it done that way. It may be a little bit harder to, say, design something for residential occupancy on the ground floor and then convert it back to commercial. But we get pizza at Blind Onion Pizza on Broadway, which has like an 8-foot tall ceiling. So I'm assuming there are some options or retrofits or appeals that people can do. So I don't know that we want to rely on the construction always being the barrier for that. I think there's probably ways to get around that. So it kind of gets back to that. Do we want to pause and see if this has any effect on housing or not?
Commissioners, Patricia Diefendorf for the record. I also just want to kind of raise up something that I said in the opening remarks, but under the circumstances and the amount of the development that we are seeing and the slowing in the development that we're seeing, I mean, Vice Chair Thompson, I understand what you're saying about, these buildings will live on. But the numbers of buildings that we're seeing built, I think they wouldn't materially make a huge difference in the urban fabric if you had these buildings integrated. As I said, so far this year, we're seeing 4 buildings in the central city and 26 elsewhere in the city. Those numbers are not of the magnitude that they would demonstrably change the urban context, the urban fabric. So I would also just encourage the commissioners to keep that in mind as well.
I did have a comment as well in this section, reflecting on how creation of ground floor units can be a real benefit from an accessibility perspective. And I think I had a comment about, can we require universal design as part of this? And maybe that's going a little bit too far for those ground floor units. But, I've been struggling with this one because I totally support that ground floor activation in creation of a dynamic street level experience, but it also provides residential activity at the street level, right? And that's eyes on the street. It provides access, potentially for seniors and folks with disabilities that really might prefer to be on a ground floor. So just considering it from that perspective as well, I think, I'm probably leaning in the direction of approval of this as written, but definitely recognize the sort of tension and complexity around how do we balance that with street level activation.
Yeah, Commissioner Pouncil here. I am for ground level, residential, but I think it's also important to be mindful. I mean, I've seen ground level residential turn into something quite creepy as well, and that that design has to be really implemented into making sure that those ground floor residents don't impact negatively the quality of the streetscape, and also that whoever is on that ground floor is also safe. So that has to be, I think that design has to be. I think, and also having the the ability to have a building be able to transform over time. We don't know what 30 years what Portland's going to look like. We have a prediction, that we're going to have a lot more people in the city. We have an entrepreneurial spirit in Portland, and people like to have their own businesses. This is an opportunity for that to, to serve that purpose as well, to be able to have that flexibility. I just also think about, the infrastructure that goes into these first floor dwellings when it comes to like fire suppression systems, in the ceiling heights, how does that impact, being able to be flexible about that ceiling height if you want to be flexible about the space in the future for going back to retail. So I just, these are just some of my concerns about, that living and, residential living. I think there's some positives and there's also some cons, and just important to be mindful of all of that, and especially where we're thinking about this housing is going to go, which is in more vulnerable areas of the city as well. So, so I just think about, how poor people will react. Most poor people are not too keen on being on the first floor of a building. So, from my experience, this is anecdotal. So, yeah, I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Commissioner Lang, I think you have a comment.
Yeah, thank you. Just a story too. When we did our Haslow project, it was 3 blocks. We were allowed to put units on the ground floor if they faced internal to the blocks. On the external side, we had to build for retail. Those ground floor units were the first ones leased up in the project. As of today, there's over 7,000 square feet of retail that hasn't been touched. It's just empty. So I think when you look at now that's not to say that if we were able to build rental units on the exterior that they would have been leased up. Who knows? But giving the developer the option to go that direction, I think is important to help spur development.
Thank you. Commissioner Rouse?
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm not being very articulate today, just generally, so forgive me. Thank you for your patience. And I hear I heard a little bit in Commissioner Pouncil's, and I'm not sure if this is true. I'm interested in like the live work potential. Like, can we allow for residential I've chatted with a few architects, a few developers, and critically, the person who cuts my hair a couple of times a year, that the interest in in having live workspace, and that could be advantaged by maintaining the height on first floor, because live work tends to be advantaged when it has almost sort of a faux mezzanine component to that first floor, and that might allow us some of that, a little flexibility around activation and also allowing for residences. I would look to other commissioners who have development experience, but I think that I wonder what is the opportunity that is before us. I also I really appreciate Chair O'Mara's note on accessibility. When we first talked about first floor residential, that's where I went immediately. The opportunity for ADA, especially because that there is age and disability are not a circle, but as one ages, the probability of accessibility needs increases. And looking at our aging population is, yeah, I think I wonder if this can be an opportunity to solve a bit for that. So yeah, I would be interested if in a discussion, what is the live work opportunity here?
So just to speak to live work opportunity. So for those who aren't familiar, it's oftentimes a ground floor with some kind of commercial space in the front. It could be retail, lots of times manufacturing, maybe jewelry making. I think somebody mentioned a spoon maker that we were talking, Commissioner Chair O'Mara, like making spoons. On the ground floor, and then there's often stairs and a mezzanine upstairs that makes it a dwelling unit upstairs. So somebody lives there and works downstairs, and the front of the building is windows and doors, and sometimes you'll see a bank of them. I think there were a couple examples mentioned here. The Everett Street lofts were one example mentioned, and then Commissioner Routh, you mentioned one on 82nd Avenue, right?
I mentioned Milepost 5. I don't know if that's an apples to apples, but I know that they have live work capacity.
And you see them in other cities too. We don't have that many examples here in Portland. The commercial space is, most of our commercial zones allow for commercial and residential. So from a zoning perspective, it's not an issue. Where it could become an issue potentially is with the building code and how they would require what they would require as far as fire separation and sprinklers. Because we've had so few of them, we don't have that much experience with them. But I would say, all in all, from the zoning code perspective, it's allowed, and there would be nothing to waive or change to continue to encourage those spaces.
Commissioners, I would also just point out, Commissioner Routh, the example you gave, that actually would demand even greater ground floor to ceiling heights than the code requires today. Because typically when you're talking about mezzanine, you're talking about probably 22 feet, is my experience anyway, with spaces that have a mezzanine. So I just want to be mindful of that. And also, I do think that the building code, I have a fair amount of experience with live work from my time in Los Angeles, and the building code does present significant challenges for live work that increase the cost. I mean, it can be done, but it does increase the cost of providing those units, because you effectively have to build them, to my understanding, you have to build them almost like discrete spaces with firewall separations and other, ADA access and ingress and egress. It starts to bring in a whole other level of requirements.
Can I ask a follow-up question? This is Commissioner Routh for the record. Thank you for that, Patricia. I'm curious if that would be, if there's an opportunity. Well, is the potential cost for live work space greater than the cost of creating unutilized or underutilized commercial space?
Commissioner Roth, I don't really know how to answer that question. I mean, I think they're very different. they have different markets and different users who would be using that space. And I think it depends. I think the main thing here is to create flexibility and to essentially allow the market to determine what is most viable at this given time, right? I think that's the approach that we're taking right now. That's the underlying premise of these recommendations. So I would just, yeah.
Sure. I guess if I may, one last follow-up, thank you. I guess I'm trying to understand because I think that I think we're trying to solve for a couple of different issues, right? Obviously, cost of a development, but also going back to the pedestrian experience and community safety, and looking at active. If I remember correctly, on the map of where active use is, it tends to follow areas that, for example, are along frequent service bus lines. And I think as one use case of, if you're at night standing in front of standing along a street, and the difference between it being a hair salon or something that does have active use behind you, or residential, like without windows. I think of, on 82nd Avenue, because I used the 72 last night, a public storage facility that has a really different relationship to community safety. And so that's just where I'm trying to figure out, like, where we can fiddle.
And so how does that thinking inform the height and window discussion?
I don't know. I mean, these are questions that I have in ignorance. So, and why I'm glad that we have an extra work session, because I don't know. I guess my question is,
because I don't think you're getting to, like, we shouldn't waive the 12-foot high. We should actually require 22 feet high. That's not what you're saying.
Yeah,
but that's what would be required for live work.
Yeah.
And then the window.
I guess a question,
right?
Maybe a future conversation around, like,
sure.
Are there incentives? Is there a way to have our cake and eat it too on active use and residential? But I think the work before us is not how to make rules that make for greater expense.
Right.
Well, one follow-up on that, Commissioner Routh, and I don't know if this is where you were headed, but, if we look at the areas that this would apply to, it is entire plan districts and overlay zones. And would there be an opportunity to maintain this requirement for Main Street and corridors in those areas, but exempt the rest of those districts, so that we're just narrowing essentially where these standards apply to those active corridors and Main
I
Streets?
think they do apply to the
narrow.
main. Yeah.
Yeah, they
do
already
apply
just
to the main
apply
streets
to
only.
not even the main street, but just certain segments of the main street. So it's not that they apply to all the entirety of the
Okay,
districts.
I misread that, because the list shows the districts.
That's a little bit deceptive. I apologize. I think we may be able to pull up a map that we showed at the last meeting that shows where these requirements are required at this time. It is discrete locations along corridors that are, I think I always appreciate Sandra's description is like the center of the center, or the sort of more active portion of the corridor that we typically think of. But again, in the scheme of things, with the number of buildings that might get developed in this interim time, would that be significant enough to really change the flavor of the area? And to my estimation, I don't think it would be. And it's also, given the crisis that we're in, I think it's a fair trade-off if we can see what we can get in terms of housing
I
by
think one of the
relaxing some of
things
the regulations.
we brought up before that also got discussed a little bit was the relationship between this being a temporary 5-year pause partially because we have not, especially say in Central City, we did not have the time to do the more detailed analysis of whether we've overreached in terms of these requirements. And so I think the intent is in that 5-year time period, we should kind of look through some of these plan districts, and especially in the Central City, and determine whether we need to pull some of those streets off, or whether we should focus on the streets that have the streetcar on it, or so on, as opposed to that grid line you can kind of see there in Central City, and it applies to whole kind of districts there. Outside the Central City, yes, it is already targeted. Hollywood is really just 2 streets. Gateway is just sort of the main sort of streets that run through that plan district. But I think the idea of this would be to allow us the time to see if we can come up with a more nuanced set of standards.
I'm pretty torn about this one because I don't know, all the points that everyone has made are well taken. And I think that unlike the eco roofs and to a lesser degree the bird safe glazing, I think this one is really has the potential to be meaningful. I think that these having uses that you can't currently lease or triggering BOLI, that's undeniably a cost to developers. Adding 2 feet or more windows, when you add 2 feet, you're adding 2 feet of material throughout the entire building, enclosure. So it's obvious that there are definitely costs. It's just a matter of considering the trade-offs. And if this was a barrier to adding 100 or 200 units somewhere in the city when we're in a housing crisis, that's where I'm like, yeah, I don't know. So I'm just very much on the fence. And when we get to straw poll, I don't know. I also kind of feel like for me, it depends how the rest of the package takes shape. And it doesn't seem like a lot of people are proposing to make tons of other cuts everywhere. But this is one that, because it is one of the more meaningful pillars, I feel like if we coupled that with other more meaningful chunks, then it's like, well, what's the point of even doing this? So that's where I'm at.
I see Commissioner Routh, you have your hand.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this map. And I 100% agree with Commissioner Thompson. This is the hard amendment. And I look at, for example, if you look, these are nodes, if you think of that. Like, for example, I think I see Division, oh, thank you. Division and 82nd Avenue, right? Like you see a little cross there. 82nd and Division is has the greatest on and off boardings in the TriMet system. It's the 72 and the 4. Mm-hmm. It has in the last iteration of the pedestrian network analysis, it had something like 18,000 on and off boardings every week. That's the MODA center, going there. So when I look at this, I see like pedestrian activity is these are specifically the nodes where we do want first floor activity of some kind. And I think one of the issues that we're hearing, and a number of other commissioners have stated it, is having first floor commercial space that is not used is also not an activation of the public realm. That does not support pedestrian activity and contribute to a sense of community safety and vibrancy. So I just want to, I don't have answers. I'm just like, this is really hard. And I'm just continuing to noodle.
And we want to clarify that the yellow streets that like the 82nd and Division Street, that's the use constraint. That's exactly where there's right, as opposed to the height.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, agree. Thank you.
So just to further point out that the height is implicated really in much less geography, if you could see that. So just want to point that out.
It is, and there's one other caveat for transparency's sake that's not shown on here, is that if there's a design overlay zone and the applicant chooses to use the design standards, then the 12-foot high also applies. We didn't put it on here because if they go through design review, then that's not invoked.
So is that applied? Does that mean you get points for it, or is it required you have to do it?
There's actually 2 standards. One is a requirement, and that's the one that's at the 12-foot provision that's in most of our plan districts. There's
Oh.
some extra points you can get if you do 15.
Oh, boy, I
So,
thought this
and
project.
that is also an item that we were proposing to suspend for 5 years. So somebody could still get points for doing the 15, but there wasn't the requirement for 12.
That's what I thought. So part of this proposal is to not preserve the requirement for 12, but you can still earn more points. Is that correct in the community design standards? Okay.
Correct.
Thanks.
So we have about an hour left and we have 3 more items. So I think we should go ahead and do a first question. Is anyone wanting to propose an amendment to this item? Does anyone know right now that they want to propose an amendment, that we should have further discussion on the specifics of that amendment? Okay. And so that would imply that we are all leaning towards approval of this proposal as written. And I understand the complexity in that admission here, but it does seem to be where we're headed, given discussion. So, is there agreement to move on to the next item? Okay. All right.
Great. Thank you for that. Yeah, that was the hard one. The other 3 are actually, I think, pretty straightforward. One of them's not really even an issue, I think. So let's just get through them. Number 5 is about bike parking, and Commissioner Spivak and Commissioner Routh had comments. Let me just refresh my memory here. Oh,
And I think Commissioner Spivak's
technical amendment.
suggestion was another item that we discussed through the technical amendment piece because it was focused on the backup aisle that some, I think, applicants or some folks reviewing permits thought that meant you needed a 5 foot by 5 foot square that was available for the bike to maneuver behind it, and it's just that it needs to be 5 feet back. It's a single dimension. So that is something that if everybody was okay with, we were going to include in our technical consent agreement. I don't think, Commissioner Spivak, you had anything else specific. We did look through the bike loud testimony. I think there were some others that also testified on the fact that they weren't necessarily against this, especially as a temporary measure, but they were looking for a direction or for staff to do some additional monitoring or to develop some type of work group. And I don't know if you would want that to be part of the Planning Commission recommendation or not, but.
I strongly support the city looking at this again and having a work group that would include bike activists and developers to come up with some. But I also support the proposal in staff report here.
Commissioner Rouse, was there anything else from your comment?
No, that Commissioner Spivak's is mine as well. I do think it also begs, in the sense that a lot of these are going back to active use, a dial, not a switch. So, a few of these considerations that we're deliberating on might benefit from some monitoring.
So that,
time. Thank you.
So for those who haven't been through this exercise before, that obviously is an amendment to the zoning code. So there wouldn't be an amendment, but we would normally put something like that in the letter of transmittal from the Planning Commission to the City Council, encouraging that take place. Okay, I think that was it for bike parking. Number 6 is a threshold for development projects to qualify for waivers. One of the testifiers was pointing out that there may be a loophole in our approach, and that a fully commercial building, somebody might propose 1 dwelling unit, and then they would be able to unlock all the have all these requirements waived. Commissioner Spivak, you're the one who put this on the table. You want to speak to that?
Sure, and I actually was worried about this when I was doing my own review also, but this testifier actually had a potential solution to it. So I thought, okay, maybe we'll see if that helps. I'm open to staff saying it doesn't, but the concern is that if you get these benefits from being residential, like not doing a full floor or not doing much glazing or all this stuff, would somebody and going through a type 2 process instead of a type 3, would someone put in a 150 square foot unit just to get all that stuff? And it's not defined right now, so they could. I would only propose being more thorough than what's currently in the code if we had a lot of benefits from acting these provisions. But as it's shaping up right now, I think that there are a lot of benefits from having residential use, because if you don't have residential use, just to be clear, you don't get any of the stuff this project's offering. So the idea is, let's make it real. And one proposal we heard from written testimony was to say you have to have 3 dwelling units with a net residential area of 1,500 square feet, whatever is larger, one or the other, and then you get the suite. So that's, someone obviously just made that up, but I was kind of interested in someone making something up, so I'll put that out as a possibility.
Our thinking about this, and I talked to BDS about it, is that it's not a real problem. We also like to assume good intent from the developer side. I don't think it's likely that somebody has a fully commercial building and is just adding 1 unit. I mean, that's a whole different building requirements, leasing. I suppose you could argue that they would just leave it empty just to unlock these. I guess that's our thinking. It's unlikely, and it's probably not a real problem that needs to be solved. But we understand the
I would say
the
that's
sentiment.
possible. I'm also a developer, and code hacks are my game, and not just my game, but everyone's game. So I don't know. I can't. But I would say that this amendment would be aligned with the interest. I don't think that if someone's really doing residential, I don't think people will be hung up by this requirement if they're doing a legit project.
Patricia Diefendorfer for the record. I just want to throw out a couple of thoughts. I think one is we wanted to also make sure that we're all assuming these things are going to be invoked with new construction, but there could be conversions of existing ground floor as well that may or may not be able to take advantage of very much of this, but there may be some things, right? Like perhaps about the bike parking or something. So I just want to make sure that we're mindful of that there could be some situations where it's conversion and it might result in just 1 or 2 units. Who knows on the ground floor. So we wouldn't want to be prohibitive in that way. And the other thing is truly the idea that you would build like financing of construction is such that you're either largely building a residential building or you're either largely building a commercial building. And I think would be little incentive to try to, especially as low as this suggestion would be. It's just it's very minor, but I don't think it would serve much of a purpose. And then if we went more, then I think we would be starting to get into the position where we're becoming kind of taking away the flexibility again. So I kind of agree with Sandra that I don't necessarily think this is something that we need to solve for. So I'll just leave it at that.
Can I ask you a question for Wade, perhaps, on to put you on the spot? If you want to do an all commercial building, and you saw some of these provisions that we've been talking about, would you consider putting in what otherwise would have been a tiny little corner of the building, a kitchen and a bathroom, and said that's my unit? Give it to me.
The short answer, no, wouldn't consider that because it's trying to get around something that was put in place for a very good reason, and the people I worked with, that's just not the way they flew. It's kind of a low backdoor way of getting something for virtually nothing. You're not providing what this is all about to get those regulations kind of set back. So I would just, if and there's people that do it differently, of course, if someone were to do that, is there any mechanism before it gets down the road to say, stop, we're not going to allow that in a commercial building? Can the city stop at that point, or do you just have to go along with it and apply all the
The answer is no.
The answer is no.
That's why I'm raising the question.
But I'm also looking at the standards. So bicycle parking, the ratio reduction is for dwelling units. So if you're doing fully commercial and you're really not, so that one you're not going to take advantage of. Ground floor active uses, you would, so that would be a win. Loading standards are for large residential projects, which these wouldn't be. Facade articulation, ground floor height. And that's it. I guess your neighborhood contact, so you wouldn't have to hold a meeting.
Type 2, type 3,
Type 2 to type 3 for projects that have
whole
housing.
project.
Yeah.
whole project, yeah.
I think one of
I'm
the
not
things
dead
we
set on
wanted,
this one. I
one of
just
the things
wanted
we
to
also wanted
tease
to
it out.
Yeah.
we wanted to stay away from is have a dwelling unit provision, partially because this is intended to both provide opportunities for dwelling units, affordable and market rate housing, but also those situations where if we're proposing some sort of group living congregate housing situation or transitional piece, it might not be a dwelling unit. It's just an area of communal or congregate living. So if we were going to do something, I was going to push towards a square footage piece, but then it runs that whole question about how much square foot is considered enough, and is it a hard and fast number, or is it a percentage? I think our sense was the market doesn't seem to be providing commercial development anyways, and what we're seeing that's being built is generally predominantly residential to begin with. So we didn't see this as something being brought up as a way to kind of skirt the regulations.
Okay.
So we drop this one?
Yeah, I'm okay dropping it.
Okay. So topic number 7, I think Commissioner Lang had some questions about nonconforming upgrades at our last meeting that we didn't address, and I know you've had some email communication. Do you want to summarize that, Phil? Just for the good of the order?
I think the way I understood it was there were some questions that came up about, we're suspending some of these standards, and so the result of that potentially would be that after 5 years you would have development that is non-conforming. And so if we did do something with the ground floor windows or did something with some of these provisions, they would be non-conforming, and would that development be on the hook in the future for bringing it up to conformance? And the response I had was that generally, we have a non-conforming situation chapter, and then a couple of these regulations do apply to major remodels. And so, for example, the ground floor height provision, if they built it at the lower height limit, we don't have anything that comes in after the fact and says, oh, you got to raise your building up 2 feet or whatever to meet the 12-foot height provision. The non-conforming upgrade chapter generally applies to things like parking lot landscaping, screening of garbage areas, things that aren't affected here. The one thing where it does apply is with long-term bike parking. And so the long-term bike parking, if they went ahead and did a major remodel, or if the site also has surface parking, and they went under this lower ratio, they would potentially have to come in and provide if they were doing a tenant improvement or other kind of provision over the thresholds, they would have to provide the long-term bike parking to meet that. Similarly, with the bird safe glazing, which might not be an issue depending on what we come up with the recommendation, the bird safe glazing does get triggered if you're doing a bunch of exterior work. That's part of a major remodel. And so if we were going to waive it for 5 years, if somebody came in 10 years from now and wanted to do a major remodel and major retrofit of that, then the bird safe glazing would apply. But I think from what we heard today, there's not really a desire to actually provide that temporary suspension. So it wouldn't really affect the non-conforming provisions here.
So that makes it through all 7 items. Can I summarize where I think we landed on everything?
Yes, thank you, Sandra.
So I have neighborhood contact, maintain the sign requirement for projects over 10,000 square feet. For EcoRoof, add an exemption for projects that are providing photovoltaic solar panels, and we'll figure out the numbers there. Bird safe glazing, an amendment to facilitate housing development by not including the ground floor windows towards the 30% trigger, and we'll figure out the details there. Bike parking, include a statement in the letter going to City Council about a work group and monitoring this. and nothing for ground floor.
Great summary. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Commissioner
To go
Spivak.
back to the one you recommended, Commissioner Mira, is for the sign, posting the sign out front. Back when this came to the Planning Sustainability Commission before, we recognized that not everyone can see, so we had a companion requirement that you email the same information to BDS, and they would make it available through an online format people subscribe to. And I'm just wondering whether that, from staff, has that actually happened? Because I don't know for sure if it has. But whether that would be a friendly amendment to say you also have to email the information in to post that way.
So the online format was a specific request. That's something we're pulling some of that information out of the code on a permanent basis. But there is still a post. They still have to notify the neighborhood association, business associations, and so on. And the sign, they have to post the sign, and there's no, even without the code provision, there's no anticipated change from BDS's standpoint about maintaining a online presence, and that's actually something that our bureau does for them. And so, yeah, if you type in, it's not the easiest thing to find actually, but under the BDS neighborhood contact, kind of if you Google it, you do get a provision where it has a map, shows the dots, shows geographical. You can see, look them up. The darker ones are the ones that have come in the last year. The lighter ones were ones that are older than a year, and people can click on those individual dots. They can see if the meeting's coming up or if it was just a meeting that already happened, and they usually has a site plan that shows what's being proposed. And that there's no intent with the suspension. The intent was that we were going to probably provide a banner that says this is not being updated for the next 5 years. But with the posting, I believe we will still probably have those get put online with that.
That's all I wanted to clarify, is that could be part of the posting, could mean on-site and to that database.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Sandra and Phil, could you just summarize next steps in terms of preparation for our next Planning Commission on the 14th?
Sure.
Thank you.
So that's just a week from today. So our hope is to write the amendments up in the next 2 days and then post them online and get it to Julie to send to you by the end of the day Thursday, because Friday the city is closed in observance of Veterans Day. So our goal is to do it by Thursday, so you'll have the weekend to take a look at the amendment language for the Tuesday meeting.
Okay. Well, I want to express appreciation to all the commissioners and staff for working through these items. I'm really proud of our work today. I think this is probably, as this commission, probably the most complicated package that we've reviewed. And so thank you all for your comments and considerations and great amendment language. And looking forward to the next meeting to review and take these items to vote and hopefully recommendation.
Yeah, so the items continue to Tuesday, November 14th.
Yes, we will continue this item to Tuesday, November 14th Planning Commission meeting. And with that, I will go ahead and adjourn our meeting for today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.